Thanks, everyone. I'm Ned Zimmerman. I'm the lead developer at Pressbooks. We're a small team based in Montreal, Canada. This is the group as it exists right now. I actually work remotely from Halifax, Canada, and we have some other remote team members as well. So I'm going to divide today's session into three overarching groups, sections. First of all, an introduction to Pressbooks and some acronyms. It's a bit of an acronym-heavy presentation, but I want to demystify some of those for anyone who's not familiar with all of them. So we'll be talking about application programming interfaces, APIs. We'll be talking about open educational resources, OER. And the second session will be a bit of a deep dive into the Pressbooks REST API. And then in my final session, I'll come back to some of the more practical user-facing applications of that API and some of the challenges we face working on it and some of our future goals. So just before we start, I want to get a sense of what your backgrounds are. So do we have any instructional designers here? No? Okay. Oh, one? Okay, great. Do we have anyone who's faculty or working in, great. Anyone working in creating content for educational and developers? Okay, a lot of developers. Awesome. All right, so a little bit about the sort of framing this whole conversation. We're talking about books. And so when we were setting out to develop an API for books, you have to start by defining what you're working with. Structure, content, context. And so the first question I want to sort of ask, not to be silly, but what's a book? Anyone? Go for it. Yes?
A sequence of pages.
A sequence of pages. Okay, great. Anyone else?
Content that people want to read.
Content that people want to read. Okay. So we've got content and structure so far being talked about. Anything else? Other pieces people want? Okay, so we have a definition that's our sort of working definition within Pressbooks. And so we describe a book as a discrete collection of text and other media designed by an author or authors as an internally complete representation of an idea or set of ideas and or an emotion or set of emotions that is transmitted to readers in various formats. So this is our source code. But basically what we have here is we've got content that's structured and that has authorship. And authorship is a kind of metadata. We'll be talking a lot about metadata here. So the attribution of the content within a book is a really important part of books as a whole, but particularly open content. So Pressbooks, what is Pressbooks? We are a plugin for WordPress, open source, GPL. More specifically, we're a plugin for WordPress multi-site. And many of you here, I'm sure, are familiar with multi-site in the higher ed context. Basically, we've got the ability to create a network of multiple sites. In Pressbooks, what we do is we take that feature and we transform the multiple sites in a conventional multi-site network into books. So instead of a network of sites, you have a catalog of books. Each book has an administrator, can have authors, editors, all of the permissions that you get in the multi-site context apply. So you can have read access to some books, write access to other books. Some of them may be public, some of them may be private. What the adaptation of WordPress for this means is that we have an interface that's hopefully familiar to people who are working with it. There's obviously some changes. So I'll walk through a few of those. So this is what the dashboard of a book in Pressbooks looks like. You can see some familiar menu items there. There's some different ones. Now we talked a bit about structure. So we've got a structure of chapters here, and then we have an organized section which I'll get to in a second. But we also talked about metadata. So one of the key areas of the interface is the book information page. And this is where you input all of the metadata for your book. You'll have an author, you might have subtitles, You may have multiple authors, contributors, editors, translators, reviewers. You will have publication dates, publisher information. You might have an ISBN if your book has an ISBN. And you'll have, very importantly for open content, licensing information. So Creative Commons licenses, public domain, and so forth. So that's the book information. Then we've got the organized area. And so within this organized area, you have the ability to take the content in your book and structure it. So you'll have the front matter of your book. You've got the main body here with chapters in it, and then there's also back matter. Now, the last piece of the interface I'll show before moving on to talking about the data model is, of course, the editor, which is fairly familiar to most people for now. So you probably picked up on the fact that these custom post types. The custom post types that we have are front matter. So this is in a book. You'll have your preface, your introduction, your foreword, those sorts of things. Parts are the structuring elements of the book. So they may not actually have content in them, but they're used to group chapters together and provide an overall structure. And sometimes you may not have more than one part. You just have all of your chapters in a single part. Chapters is a common concept. And then back matter, you've got afterwords, appendices, glossary of terms, indexes, that sort of thing. We have one other custom post type, which is information custom post type. There's only ever one of those, and we just attach the metadata for the book to that single post. So that's the data model in short. We also have custom. Oops. We also have a custom theme structure. Now, the reason for this is twofold. So we're looking at books on the web, and we're looking at books in other formats. So for books on the web, we're going to need to handle navigation differently than a typical WordPress site. I want to talk about that in terms of the structure piece. So I'm just going to switch over to the browser for a second. If we look at websites, we'll have, I think you can kind of divide them into two loose categories. So this site here, it's got pages, right? So if you're navigating this, you'll go to where you want to go based on what information you're trying to find. There's not a reading order attached to it. It's entirely based on what the user is trying to get from that website. And then if we go over to the WordPress blog, it's reverse chronological. And if you get to the bottom, you'll be able to go back in time and read older posts. So both of those are loose categories that regular websites fall into. Books are sort of halfway in between because you've got a reading order, but it's not a chronological order, it's not a reverse chronological order. So we sort of need to hijack some of the typical WordPress navigation and make it work for that use case. So we have a webbook theme that includes a cover page here. So I'll go through and show you a live one. So this has got a cover page with the ability to download the book in various formats. You've got your table of contents here. And you've got some metadata. And so then you can click through to the interface, and you'll get your forward here, and you can drop down and see the other contents of the book and navigate through it. And this is all responsive, works really well on small devices. And then there's other features that I won't get into. I won't search it in the book and that sort of thing. So that's the web book. And I just mentioned export formats. So this is the real core competency of Pressbooks that we've been, sort of the problem we wanted to solve when we first created the project was the ability to author in a single place and then have a single source for a variety of formats. So we've got the web books, which I just showed you. And then we have a bunch of other things. So we've got PDF for print on demand, we've got PDF for digital distribution. We have EPUB 2.3, we've got Mobi for Kindle devices, and then we have some other formats like HTML, book, Open Document, WXR, and we also export compression files for LMS integration. So, exports and webhooks. So the first 5 years of Pressbooks, our real user base was primarily self-published authors. So we have a software as a service at Pressbooks.com, which we still run, and that's where most of our users were. And then we started to get a lot of people taking the open source plugin and setting it up for open content creation, and asking us to set it up and host it for them so they could run open content creation projects for their institutions. So we've got the BC Open Textbooks project. We have Rebus Press. We've got UC Berkeley's Open Book Publishing project, Alabama Publishing in Troy, and Campus Ontario in Ontario, Canada. So let's talk about open content and educational resources. So I'm sure some of you at least are familiar with this, but basically we're talking about teaching and learning materials that are available at no cost with attribution and with open licensing, so that they can be adapted and repurposed and reused in different contexts. There are 5 principles here that are outlined in a document that I'll link to in the notes, and but they're sort of identified as the 5 R activities of open content. David Wiley was one of the people who was instrumental in sort of defining these principles. The right to retain, so this is managing your own content, managing the way it's used, stored, retrieved, etc. You've got the right of reuse, so the right to use content that's been created in a variety of different ways. The right to revise, so this is adaptation, adjusting, modifying content. So you might translate an existing open content piece into a different language or adapt it for different scripts. Remixing is really interesting, where you take content from different sources and combine it to create something new. So you might create a course reader, as it were, of open content, where you're drawing chapters from different open license materials and combining them into a new piece of content. And then lastly, the redistribution. So this is where those download formats on the webbook come into play. That content is available to be redistributed and used by anyone free of charge. So, based on original writing by David Wiley, attribution license. So I wanted to make sure that is right. So, with open content, this is where the necessity for an API comes into play. And this is where we sort of became interested in this, as we saw this use case being taken up by various users of Pressbooks, and we were seeing demand for it from our clients. In 2013, Hugh McGuire, the founder of Pressbooks, he gave a talk and he contended that a publisher's job is to provide good APIs for their books, which is an interesting claim. And basically, the idea is, if you're creating a book in the digital world that we're in nowadays, that book, if it has a robust API attached to it, is going to be much more useful, even if it's not openly licensed. If a book has an API where you can create the metadata about that book, it's much easier to pull it into different cataloging systems, online stores, libraries, and so forth. But if you're dealing with open content, it becomes really interesting, and we'll get into some of those possibilities in a moment. So APIs. Who here wants to give me the definition of an API? I'm sure a lot of you can. Okay, go for it.
A way to programmatically send commands to another application or get information from.
Yeah, so a way to programmatically send commands to another application or get information from it. So that's a great definition. The way I like to describe this is, if we look at this webbook on Pressbooks, this is what it looks like to me as a person who's visiting the browser and viewing it in the browser. If I run something like curl or wget or whatever, it's going to look like this. And there's information in here. You know, if you look in here, you can see there's a schema.org blob up there with some metadata. Up in the head, you'll find the title of the book. You'll find other information there. But you kind of have to work to get that extracted by a computer if you're trying to pull that information into another service or application. So that's where having an API comes in, where you can expose that information in a way that's structured and machine readable. And so we're an open source project, and we have one of our, oh yeah, I just want to mention this also. I realized after having worked on this project for most of the last year that I didn't actually know what REST stood for when I was assembling this slide deck earlier in the week. It stands for Representational State Transfer. So when you hear REST API, what that means is it's talking about an application programming interface specifically for web applications to communicate with each other, as opposed to other APIs which may be within an application on PHP or something like that. So we're an open source project, as I mentioned, getting into the deep dive here. Our first REST API was actually contributed by one of our regular open source contributors, Brad Payne, who works at WPCampus. He read Hugh's article, saw Hugh's talk, and responded to that idea, and pull requested in September 2014 and built a version 1 REST API for us, which is awesome. So props to Brad. I know he's checking the live stream. So I want to take a little look at Brad's API, which was really foundational for us when we were looking at building the next iteration of it. So endpoints. There's two real endpoints I want to talk about here. An endpoint being sort of analogous to part of an application that you as a user might access. So you've got a books endpoint here. This gets information about the collection of books in a network. If I look at this catalog page on a Pressbooks network, that's what I would see. That's sort of the equivalent to that collection data that you get in that books endpoint. Then if you pass the book ID, so this is the WordPress site ID of a particular book to the end of that endpoint, you'll get information about that specific book. You can also pass search parameters to it to get sort of zero in on specific pieces of content within the book. So here's an example of an open textbook on Pressbooks network. I want to look at, actually just look live at the API results from this book here. So let's pull it up. So this is, again, this is the version 1 API. I'll zoom in so that everyone can see it. So we've got the book ID and a link. We have a blob of metadata here. So we've got a title. There's two authors. We have blank fields for other types of contributors. We've got a link to the cover image. We've got a language. We have a publication date, which some of you may recognize as a Unix time string. We've got a publication year that's a little more human readable. And then we have a license and a brief description. One thing I'll point out about these pieces of metadata is that they're pulled directly from our database. So they're namespaced with PB for Pressbooks. This isn't an interoperable metadata standard by any means, and that's something we wanted to change in the version 2 API. So I'll talk about that when we get to the version 2 API. If we scroll down further here, we get to the table of contents. So again, this is structured in the way that I described earlier, where you have a group of front matter, you have a group of parts. Within each part, there's a group of chapters here. And then if I collapse the parts here, we'll see the back matter. So that's the general structure of that version 1 book API. And so that's where we were until 2016. And then in 2016, after many years of work by the REST API team, we had WordPress 4.7 Vaughan, which came out and included core content endpoints for post pages, custom post types, and taxonomies. And that was, for us, an opportunity to take the work that Brad had done and expand upon it and build second generation of Pressbooks REST API. And I think this is, I want to highlight the fact that that version 1 API was built completely from scratch. There was no infrastructure to build it on, so Brad wrote that all from the ground up, which is pretty awesome. So credit where due for that. So we got some funding from WPCampus Ontario and Ryerson University to work on this open publishing project in 2017. And that's when we really started to dive into this version 2 REST API and some applications for it. And we had three kind of key goals that I would describe when we started this project. So the first of which was to really just leverage the work of the WordPress REST API. Because building from nothing and building from many years of research, thought processes, design decisions, and testing was, we thought there was a lot of potential to get a lot from the work that they'd already done by building on top of their work. Our second thing was interoperability for the metadata, as I mentioned. So we have our own metadata in the database, but it's not really useful to other applications unless it's turned into a standard that's readable and interoperable with other standards. And so for this, we settled on schema.org. It's very comprehensive, it's very widely used, and recognized on the web and in other contexts. And it also has an extension for bibliographic purposes. So the bibliographic extension includes things like chapters, other types of authorship that are unique to books and literary materials. And so it seemed like a good fit for what we were trying to do with this. So if we look at just as a comparison, we had that original version 1 REST API, which took the data we had in our database and exposed it over the endpoint. We have PB title and PB authors here. So in the version 2 REST API, what we do is we transform that into a blob of schema data. And this gives us the ability, we can actually take this and put it right into the web as JSON linked data, and it's readable by Google and search engines with no extra effort. So that was our second goal, that interoperability piece. And then our third goal was to support full content CRUD operations, create, read, update, and destroy on all of our custom content types. And so when we're talking about CRUD, just for anyone who's not familiar, it's a funny acronym. We're talking about reading, so we have this webbook here, we can read this book. Then if we go into the editor interface, I can go up here and I can add a new part or a new chapter, that's create. I can change this one and save it, which is the update piece, or I can move it to the trash, which is destroy. So having CRUD capability on an API means you can use the API as an authenticated user to do all of those same operations via a piece of software. So this could mean you build an editing interface that's outside of the WordPress dashboard that can create chapters, edit them, update them, and so forth. So with that one, didn't quite get all the way. And the main reason for this is because without additional tools installed, the WordPress REST API doesn't support remote authenticated access. You have to install basic auth or JSON tokens or other solutions to enable that. It does work within a network, so we were able to do some interesting stuff there, which I'll talk about later on. But we were able to get a full content read API for the web, which is really exciting, and that's something I'll also touch on a little bit. So, planning our endpoints. We really looked back to the version 1 API when we were trying to approach this project, where we have network level endpoint that looks all the books. So we've got a collection. This is our new API endpoint for that. And then instead of having all of that data for each book only available at the network level by adding a book ID and getting the table of contents about it and everything, we also added endpoints at the book level. So now if you're at a particular book, you can hit the table of contents endpoint, which gives you that same structured table of contents. You can get metadata from that endpoint as well, which gives you basically just a JSON LD blob with all the schema data. And you can get content for the front matter, parts, chapters, and back matter. Technical approach. So for our projects, we use two moving coding standards. We like this because it's based on the WordPress coding standards, but it uses some other modern PHP techniques like namespacing. And it has an opinionated file layout that makes organizing a really complex coding like Pressbooks really straightforward. and clear. So that's the system we use for building this, which defines this file layout. So getting really into the nitty-gritty here, you have an API namespace with endpoints, controller classes, and elaborate namespaced functions. So I want to take a look at the post controller and talk a little bit about that, and then we can see some live data from a post API call. When you're working with the REST API, there's a lot of documentation in the REST API handbook. And one of the things that they say is that you really should not try to override methods of parent classes when you're inheriting them. If you need to inherit a class and work with it, your best bet is to use filters and actions to override the data that's coming out of that class instead of changing methods. Because if you change methods and then the parent class needs to change them for some reason, then you're going to be in a bad backwards compatibility hell situation. So when we were building our post controller class, we kind of got into it with these four different methods. One controller that handles all four of these content types. So we extend that post controller, construct it, and then we set our own namespace, Pressbooks version 2. And then we call this override using filters and actions, which within it contains different filters to handle different pieces. So we'll look at them one by one, and feel free to stop if you have a question about this. The first piece is query arguments. So if we're listing all the chapters in a book or any of the other content types, I talked about that reading order and the importance of reading order in a book context. The default order that you get from WordPress REST API call is not the reading order. We use the menu order property to define the reading order of chapters and all the other content types. So we just use this filter here to switch that argument and make sure that the chapters and all the other content types are being listed in their reading order. So that's the first one. Then modifying the response. So we're talking about content that uses, it's hierarchical. So when you have a chapter, it's always going to be associated with a parent part, and it has a part ID that it's referring back to. So what we wanted to make sure with this is that if you call the endpoint and you put a chapter, it can identify from that response what the parent part of that chapter is. So this method here, it adds a link to parent part within the API response for a chapter. Then also, we have chapter level and front matter and back matter level metadata. So if you're talking about a book that has multiple authors, for example, a compilation of chapters from different sources, you're going to have different authorship data for each of those chapters. And it's important that that be exposed to the API as well. So we add a metadata endpoint, so this is sort of a sub-endpoint for each chapter. It gives you that JSON metadata log for that chapter as well. So that's linked from the API response for chapter 2. So let's look at one. That's probably a good place to go now. So if we load this up, this is the first piece of front matter in that text that I was showing you earlier. So as you can see, if we go back to this version 1 API, let's compare the two, because it's interesting to see what we were able to add just by using the core REST API infrastructure. So this is the original response for that front matter right here, ID4. And then if we not that one, ID 157. So then if we go and look at the version 2 API response for it, we've got some more things. We've got the date created and modified. We have post status. We've got a raw and rendered full content for it. We have the ID of the user who created it. And we also have contextual links to other API endpoints, which is really interesting. So you get a link to the collection of all front matter. You get a link to the author file as much as it's on the REST API for the author of that piece of content. You get revision history, and you get that metadata endpoint that I talked about, as well as any media attached to it. So just by being able to build on that WordPress REST API, you get all this extra contextual information about the content we're looking at. So that's the front matter endpoint as an example. Let's look at table of contents. So with table of contents, again, it's in the TOC class here. If we go back to the one REST API, we have these post objects here. If we go to the table of contents for this book, we're going to get, again, the same structure. So building on the solid work that was done in the version 1 API, we just get a whole bunch more data. And then we again have links to full content endpoints for each piece of content in the book. So you can load that and then hit the different ones that you want to get the full content. Not a huge change structurally, but there's a lot more context, a lot more information there. And then last, I'll talk about the metadata endpoint. So with metadata, basically, we just wanted to get that metadata from our core database storage into a schema.org format. So we built a helper function that did that. Actually, a couple of helper functions that did that. And this is what we get. So now we've got schema.org metadata output with this is a thema subject code. We've got authors, we have a publication date that's actually mutable now, as well as mutable. We've got a license and some custom license text. So that's another thing. Our licensing and attribution lets you pick a license and add specific information for your institution or publishing company. And again, we've got just a link back to that endpoint. So that's the ability that gives us the ability to use this metadata in other interesting interoperable ways. So putting it all together, if we hit this endpoint to get the full information about a book on the version 2 API, we now have metadata in an interoperable format. We've got a table of contents with a great deal of additional context based on the WordPress REST API defaults. And then we have links to the full content endpoints for every piece of content in the book, structured in the same way that the full content is structured. So just by building on the REST API infrastructure, we were able to take the work that Brad did and expand it and give us some new and really exciting capabilities. So again, just looking at the structure here, you hit the book's endpoint, you get an individual book with metadata and table of contents, and then you can drill down through the different levels to get full content and metadata for each piece. So practical application, what does it actually do? So we have all this information, what can we do with it? Well, let's go back to those 5R activities that we talked about earlier. One of the key features that we wanted to develop as part of this project with WPCampus Ontario and Ryerson was the ability to reuse and remix openly licensed books from a Pressbooks network. So with that in mind, we built a cloning tool. So if you're running Pressbooks 4.1 or later, so anything from late last fall until the present, you can hit the URL of Pressbooks book, give it a new site URL on your own network, and if it's licensed properly, you can clone it. You get extra attribution data added to the new cloned book that says this book was cloned from an originally created book at this URL, licensed under this attribution license. So as an open content creator or someone who's working with open content, you can use this tool to pull other open works into your own Pressbooks network, add them, change them for your context, and do that sort of reuse and remixing our 5R activity. So the other thing that we we're able to do with this API was that catalog I showed you earlier. This is actually just built by using the Books Endpoint on the new REST API to build a catalog and build the outputs with metadata attached to them. So you can filter by subject and license, you can sort. And so that's another exciting application. And there's only a few things that we've done with them, but we're really excited about what this will enable other people who are working with Pressbooks and working with open content to do. And we have some goals that we want to work towards as well. And some of those have to do with a few challenges that we encountered while working on this project. So I'll say the first one is, as I mentioned earlier, no built-in authentication system. Right now, you can only clone private books within your own network. You can't do any of the CRUD activities on the remote network. We'd like to enable that functionality. It's not necessarily relevant for open content, cloning a private book, probably not an openly licensed book, but there are workflows where you might want to move something from, say, a in-production server to a live public server once the book's done being written. So we'd like to be able to enable that functionality, and that's something we are exploring a best practice for in terms of an authentication flow. It can be built ideally into Pressbooks itself. The second one, anyone who's worked with multi-site knows that switch to blog is a function that really hits your database in a very painful way, and that has not been fixed yet. I say yet, not in any shipping version of WordPress, but the multi-site team has been working on this. So props to Jeremy Felt and the others. We've got a couple new things that have landed. There's now a central table for blog metadata, which will power a new site endpoint in the REST API. I believe that should be shipping in WordPress 5. And when it does, that will let us do a lot more with the book collection, because we won't be having to switch to each individual book to retrieve the metadata about them. We'll be able to hit one table, we'll be able to add the metadata that we want to be exposed to that table and retrieve it all in one database query instead of a bunch of really expensive switching queries. So that's very exciting. This is another one that was unfortunate. We namespaced our REST root under the Pressbooks version 2 namespace, and then found out that Gutenberg doesn't support namespaced REST roots for editing content yet. There's an open ticket about it. We're trying to look at ways to approach that, and I think there's a solution that's been hit upon by some of the core people working on Gutenberg that they feel happy with. So our hope is that that will be resolved, and we're trying to engage on that problem. But obviously that's held us back from working with Gutenberg a little bit. We can't edit any of our content in it. So that's one other thing. But we do have some really exciting future plans, which I'll just touch on briefly and you can take a few questions. We want to enhance our cloning process. So right now, we don't have any attachment metadata. So images don't have licenses attached to them, but for open content, that's obviously really important. So Brad Payne, I mentioned earlier, who contributed our version 1 REST API, he's actually working on adding that feature to Pressbooks right now. And once that happens, we'll be able to expand the cloning feature so that it pulls in attachment metadata as well and preserves that attribution across the cloning operation. We want to just generally improve the fidelity of the cloning process. I think because of the way WP Auto P works, sometimes we get weird white space changes that are a little confusing, and so we're trying to clean that up and make sure that the content is literally, you can diff it and it's the same. And then again, we also have a really interesting and important use case, which is trying to figure out how we handle third-party content within Pressbooks. A lot of people in the educational space use things like H5P, which some of you may be familiar with, to add interactive quizzes and other content like that to their Pressbooks books. And we just want to develop a good strategy for how to hook into, hook those kinds of content into the cloning operations. So if you're cloning a book, you get everything that's part of that book. Or you have a good system for gracefully falling back and indicating that content couldn't be cloned, so it's not just missing. So that's an important feature that we want to work on. And then for the catalogs, when that site's endpoint feature lands, we're going to look at improving performance drastically, and we're going to look at progressively using it to filter and search and load more books live, which right now we aren't doing because the database concerns. So that's a few things. I also just want to mention, right now, the sort of weird coincidence of timing, Stephanie Leary is giving a talk on WordPress plugin choices for higher education. She was an early contributor to Pressbooks. She built our import feature. And so we couldn't see each other's talk, which is sort of sad, but she's been working on a really interesting integration with 10up's distributor plugin, which some of you may have heard about. Basically a content syndication over the REST API. And so we had a really interesting chat about that yesterday, and basically linking that into cloned content with Pressbooks would allow you to have a syndicated chapter that updates itself from the original book when changes are made in the original book. So those are the kind of things working with the REST API for open content are pretty exciting. And that's really all I have to say. So, oh yeah, one other thing, well that's kind of related, but content discovery and aggregation. Finding open content is something that we'd like to enable with this REST API as well. So if we can build tools to list it publicly and make it available for others to clone it, discover, and do things with it. That's another use case we're really interested in. So thank you, and happy to take any questions. Yes.
We're talking about, it's not really about the API, but about Pressbooks. We're talking earlier about the export capabilities. Are those all built in, or do they have to, do you need extensions?
So they're all built in with the caveat that you can install some server dependencies that can be a bit of a pain.
Okay.
Particularly EPUB creation and Kindle creation are not fun. Kindle Gen is required for building Kindles, and you have to generate an EPUB2 file and then validate it and then turn it into a Kindle file. So you need to install some libraries for that. For PDF, our default PDF exporter uses Prince XML, which some of you may be familiar with. It's quite pricey. The server license is several $1,000s, but there's a service called DocRaptor, which is basically Prince as a service. And we have an integration for that where you can just drop an API key in, and it's quite affordable, and you can get PDF exports by hitting that service and then pulling the PDF back. But yes, all of those formats I mentioned are all built into the core plugin. You just have to install and configure the server dependencies, with the one exception of the LTI common cartridge exports. It's another plugin that we build and maintain as well, and others have also created LTI common cartridge exports for Pressbooks, but we have our own. And it's just not built into core because we still do have that core, that user base of self-publishing authors who don't need LTI integration, so we just have it as an add-on for educational uses rather than the core plugins. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah.
So, say somebody wanted to start creating an API.
Yeah.
Where would you recommend that they start? Like, from step one. They've never done it before.
Yeah.
Where would they start?
Well, I mean, I think where I sort of started with the talk in terms of really trying to understand the content you're working with at a really high level. So with a book, you like it would be premature to start touching code at all until you really know like all of the considerations of context, content structure, metadata, all the pieces that give you a full picture of whatever the content is that you're trying to expose over the API. And so I think we had a number of years working with books and trying to understand them and work with the content in those ways. So we already had a pretty good understanding of them to begin with. But yeah, I think that's what I would say. The absolute first step is make sure you really know your content inside and out, how it works, what if it is missing something, what does it need to not be broken? You know, because if you have a book, you have all the chapters in the wrong order, it's no good to anyone, right? So knowing that kind of thing, that's going to really inform all of the decisions that you make around the API. Yeah, that's what I'd say. Yes.
Just go back. I'm a little confused on where we stand on Gutenberg, and especially because I literally just installed Pressbooks for the school within the last week or two, and I and the intern are trying to find our way around. And we've got parallel efforts going on. Haven't yet turned faculty loose on trying to create stuff. But I've also got, and it's many of the same faculty, just about starting up on other WordPress projects. Well, you know, they don't have Gutenberg yet, but I'm looking forward to fall semester and what happens. So am I looking at possibly the near future? I've got a bunch of people that are learning how to edit using Gutenberg in WordPress, and then the Pressbooks were still in TinyMCE.
Yeah. So I'll be frank, like we because of this namespace issue, we haven't been able to work with it at all. I think the other thing is our use case is one that will take a lot of thinking of Gutenberg to get it working properly. When you're creating a book, just as an example, when you're creating a book, you don't want people putting in background colors. So there's a lot of the core Gutenberg functionality that we have to lock down. We have custom content types that will be really well served by blocks. So that's pretty exciting. Like in textbooks,
Maybe your own custom Gutenberg blocks.
Yeah, well, I mean, some of the core ones will obviously be using like paragraphs and certain things, but just as one example, in textbooks, you often have like kind of key takeaways blocks with a few key points, and we have, you know, TinyMCE menus and buttons that insert those kind of things. But those will be way easier for people to work with as blocks, I think. So I'm pretty excited about that. But the reality is we're a really small team. There's 2 full-time developers and 1 part-time developer in our team of 7 or 8 people. And so we're not going to be ready for it when it launches. And we really want to make sure that we take the time to get it right for users, because we've got lots of existing content in Pressbooks, and we don't want to do anything that disrupts or disturbs that, because if you have a book that's in print and something changes about it, that's really bad. So, you know, we really want to make sure that we get it right. So I would say we're sort of internally considering that certainly won't be enabling Gutenberg from day one, even assuming we get this API endpoint situation figured out.
So probably interim strategy then is
maintaining the classic editor.
And that'll be built in. So
So you won't have to install.
It's not like Pressbooks is going to hang on to 4.9.
Oh no.
Whatever.
What we'll be doing is we'll be building the same code that disables Gutenberg.
So you just build the classic editor.
We'll build it into Pressbooks so that until it's ready to go, there won't be any configuration needed.
Great.
Because there's also things, as I mentioned in WordPress 5, we really want. Like, we want that site endpoint. That's going to be amazing. It's going to enable us to do a lot. So we're just going to prevent Gutenberg from being activated until it's ready, and the upgrade process should be, well, the upgrade to 5 will be seamless, and then the upgrade to Gutenberg will be a process, and we'll obviously be working with users to figure out how to make that work really well. Yeah. Other questions? Okay. Thanks, everyone.